The night sky over Copenhagen in early September 1807 was not illuminated by the moon, but by a man-made inferno. From the rigging of British warships anchored in the Sound, sailors watched a spectacle of destruction that would redefine the rules of engagement for the 19th century. Inside the Danish capital, the scene was apocalyptic. The spire of the Church of Our Lady, the tallest in the city, had turned into a torch, collapsing in a shower of sparks that ignited the wooden neighborhoods below. This was not a battlefield in the traditional sense. There were no lines of infantry trading volleys, no cavalry charges, and surprisingly, for an operation led by the Royal Navy, no ship-to-ship broadsides ringing out across the water. This was the Second Battle of Copenhagen, though battle is perhaps the wrong word. It was a siege, a standoff, and ultimately a heist. To the modern observer, the events of 1807 are often confused with the more famous engagement of 1801, the battle where Horatio Nelson famously put a telescope to his blind eye and ignored orders to retreat. That 1801 battle was a contest of naval tactical brilliance. The 1807 operation was something entirely different. Nelson was dead, fallen at Trafalgar 2 years prior. The age of chivalric naval duels was fading, replaced by a colder, more brutal pragmatism. The British were not here to fight the Danish fleet. They were here to steal it. To understand why the Royal Navy felt compelled to incinerate the capital of a neutral nation, we must look away from the Baltic Sea and turn our gaze to a raft floating in the middle of the Niemen River, nearly 1,000 miles away. 2 months prior, in July 1807, the two most powerful men in Europe met on this raft to divide the world between them. Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, master of the French land armies, and Tsar Alexander I of Russia sat down to sign the Treaty of Tilsit. For Great Britain, Tilsit was a catastrophic geopolitical nightmare. For over a decade, Britain had relied on a strategy of funding continental coalitions to keep Napoleon busy on land, while the Royal Navy ruled the waves. But at Tilsit, the coalition collapsed. Russia, Britain's last major ally, had not only surrendered, but had joined Napoleon's continental system, an economic blockade designed to starve the British Isles into submission. But the Treaty of Tilsit contains something far more dangerous than economic sanctions. It contains secret articles, clandestine clauses that British intelligence desperately needed to uncover. While the exact method of how this intelligence reached London remains a subject of debate, stories range from a British spy hiding beneath the barge to a disaffected Russian courtier leaking the details. The message that reached George Canning, the British Foreign Secretary, was unequivocal and terrifying. The intelligence revealed that Napoleon and Alexander had agreed to force the neutral nations of Europe, specifically Denmark and Portugal, to close their ports to British ships and, more critically, to hand over their naval fleets to France. This was the League of Armed Neutrality weaponized. Napoleon, having lost his own navy at Trafalgar, intended to rebuild his maritime strength by confiscating the fleets of weaker nations. Canning looked at the numbers and saw the existential threat immediately. The Royal Navy was the only shield protecting Britain from invasion. If Napoleon could seize the Danish fleet, comprising roughly 20 ships of the line and a dozen frigates, and combine it with the Russian and remnants of the French and Spanish navies, the balance of power in the North Sea would shift disastrously. The wooden walls of England would be breached. The British government faced a moral and strategic precipice. Denmark was neutral. It had done nothing to provoke Britain. Attacking them would be a violation of international law and would paint Britain as a tyrant in the eyes of the world. But waiting for Napoleon to seize those ships would likely mean the invasion of England. In the calculus of 1807, survival outweighed morality. The order was given. The Danish fleet must be secured. By diplomacy if possible, by force if necessary. The most powerful armada the North Sea had ever seen began to gather, not to fight an enemy, but to crush a potential one. The force that departed Great Britain in late July 1807 was staggering in its scale. It was an armada designed not just to defeat an enemy, but to overawe them into submission without firing a shot. The expeditionary force consisted of nearly 30,000 troops, transported by a massive flotilla of over 380 transport ships. Escorting them were 25 ships of the line, roughly 40 frigates and smaller vessels, and a specialized train of siege artillery. To put this in perspective, this force was larger than the one that would later land in Portugal to kickstart the Peninsular War. Commanding the naval element was Admiral James Gambier, a man known more for his religious piety than his tactical genius, earning him the nickname Dismal Jimmy. Commanding the land forces was Lord Cathcart, but hidden among the roster of commanders was a younger Major General who would eventually eclipse them all, Sir Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington. He was there to lead a division, still fresh from his victories in India, about to cut his teeth on European warfare. As this leviathan of wood and canvas filled the Resund, the narrow strait separating Denmark from Sweden, the psychological pressure on the Danish government was immediate. The Royal Navy effectively corked the bottle. They controlled the waters completely, isolating the island of Zealand, where Copenhagen sat, from the rest of the Danish kingdom and, crucially, from any French aid that might come marching up from the mainland. But before the guns were run out, the diplomats were sent in. This was the era of gunboat diplomacy in its most literal sense. The British envoy, Francis Jackson, was dispatched to meet the Danish Crown Prince Frederick at Kiel. The instructions Jackson carried from London were extraordinary. He was to present an ultimatum that was, for all intents and purposes, a protection racket offer. Jackson sat across from the Crown Prince and laid out the British terms. Denmark was to hand over its entire navy to Great Britain. The British government pledged on its most sacred honour that the fleet would be held only as a deposit. It would be kept safe in British ports, protected from the French, and returned to Denmark in the exact same condition once the war with Napoleon was concluded. In exchange, Britain would offer Denmark a defensive alliance and a subsidy to protect it from French retribution. To the British, this was a logical, pragmatic solution to a desperate problem. To Crown Prince Frederick, it was an outrageous insult to national sovereignty. Imagine the scenario. A foreign power arrives at your doorstep with an army, demands you hand over your primary means of national defense for your own safety, and promises to give it back later if you behave. The Crown Prince's reaction was explosive. He viewed the ultimatum as a betrayal by a nation Denmark had considered a friend. He argued that Denmark's neutrality was sacrosanct and that he had the will and power to defend it against Napoleon. Jackson, however, knew what the prince refused to admit. The Danish army was deployed in Holstein to the south, guarding the border against the French. Copenhagen itself was defended largely by militia. If Napoleon marched, Denmark would fall in weeks, and the ships would become French. The talks collapsed immediately. Crown Prince Frederick, in a move that historians still debate, prioritized honor over survival. He refused the ultimatum. He then made a critical tactical error. He sent orders to Copenhagen to prepare for a siege, but he himself did not return to the capital to lead the defense. Instead, he retreated to the mainland to be with the main army, leaving the defense of the capital in the hands of an aging engineer officer, General Ernst Peymann. With the diplomatic channel severed, the machinery of war began to turn. On August 16th, the British army began its landing at Vedbæk, north of Copenhagen. The Danish defense was so unprepared that the British landed 30,000 men without a single shot being fired against them. It was a textbook amphibious operation. The British plan was now simple but brutal. Compellence. They would not storm the walls of Copenhagen. The cost in British lives would be too high. Instead, they would encircle the city on land and sea, cut off its food and water, and bring up the heavy siege guns. They would prove to General Peymann that he had no hope of relief. The Royal Navy, which had spent centuries fighting other ships, now turned its broadsides toward the city skyline. The Copenhagen standoff was over. The siege had begun. By late August, Copenhagen was a city trapped in a vice. The geography of the capital worked against its defenders. Situated on the eastern coast of the island of Zealand, it faced the sea where the Royal Navy's masts formed a forest of timber blocking the horizon. To the landward side, the city was surrounded by ancient, star-shaped ramparts, formidable defences in the 17th century, but now merely a container for the population trapped inside. Lord Cathcart moved his 30,000 troops with methodical precision. They established a cordon sanitaire, a complete semicircular blockade around the city's western perimeter. This was not a hasty manoeuvre, it was an engineering project. British sappers dug parallels and trenches, inching their heavy batteries closer to the city walls. The water supply from the lakes outside the city was cut. The food supply from the surrounding farmland was severed. The city was now an island in every sense, cut off from the world, with only its stockpiles to rely on. Inside the city, General Payman did his best to organise a defence, but his resources were pitiful. The professional Danish army was, as noted, stuck on the mainland, guarding against the French. Payman was left with a garrison of roughly 5,000 regular troops and a motley collection of citizens, students, and militia. These were brave men, but they were not soldiers. They lacked the drill, the discipline, and the equipment to face the hardened veterans of the British Army and the King's German Legion, German expatriates fighting for Britain who were widely considered some of the finest light infantry in Europe. The desperation of the Danish position became tragically clear on August 29th, in the only significant land engagement of the campaign, the Battle of Kør. A force of Danish militia had gathered south of Copenhagen, hoping to strike the British rear and break the siege. Lord Cathcart dispatched Sir Arthur Wellesley with a detachment to deal with them. This was a mismatch of historic proportions. On one side was the future conqueror of Napoleon, leading disciplined lines of redcoats and green-jacketed riflemen. On the other was a force largely composed of peasants, farmhands, and local volunteers. The engagement is often remembered by its sombre nickname, the Battle of the Clogs. Many of the Danish militia were so poorly equipped that they marched to war in their heavy wooden farm shoes. When Wellesley's troops opened fire and then charged with the bayonet, the militia broke. As they tried to flee across the muddy fields, their wooden clogs bogged them down or slipped off, leaving them vulnerable to the pursuing British cavalry. It was a massacre rather than a battle. Over 1,500 Danes were captured or killed, while Wellesley suffered fewer than 200 casualties. This victory at Kør was the final nail in the coffin for Copenhagen's hope. Wellesley had effectively swept the chessboard clean. There would be no relief force. No army was coming to save the capital. General Payman watched from the ramparts as the British tightening their grip. He could see the British engineers constructing battery positions within mortar range of the city centre. The British strategy had shifted from containment to preparation for annihilation. They dragged massive 24-pounder cannons and heavy mortars through the mud, positioning them not to breach the walls for an assault, but to fire over them. The targets were not the soldiers on the ramparts, but the densely packed timber-framed houses, the warehouses, and the shipyards beyond. On September 1st, the British commanders sent one final message to Payman. The terms were the same: surrender the fleet and the city will be spared. Refuse and the bombardment begins. Payman, bound by his orders from the Crown Prince to defend the city to the last, and perhaps underestimating the sheer destructive potential of the new British weaponry, refused. The diplomats packed their bags. The time for words had ended. On the morning of September 2nd, the British gunners stood by their lanyards and the Royal Navy bomb vessels warped into position. The terror bombardment was about to begin. At 7:30 p.m. on September 2nd, 1807, the silence of the Danish twilight was shattered. It began with the deep, thumping report of the mortars from the British land batteries, quickly joined by the distinct roar of the bomb ketches anchored in the harbour. Ships like HMS Thunder and HMS Vesuvius, names that grimly foreshadowed their function, began to lob massive explosive shells in high, lazy arcs over the city walls. For the civilians of Copenhagen, the first few hours were terrifying but confusing. Siege warfare in the 18th century usually focused on the walls, breaching the stone defences so infantry could storm in. But these shells weren't hitting the walls. They were falling into the market squares, crashing through the slate roofs of townhouses and exploding in the cellars of bakeries and schools. The British objective was not to breach the defences. It was to break the will of the population. But the true horror of the bombardment came from a new, experimental weapon that was making its grand and terrifying debut, the Congreve rocket. Invented by William Congreve, these were primitive, ungainly devices, essentially large metal tubes packed with gunpowder and a combustible tar mixture attached to a long, stabilizing stick. They were notoriously inaccurate. A stiff breeze could send them spiraling off course. In a battlefield scenario against moving troops, they were almost useless. But against a large, stationary target like a city, they were devastating. The British fired thousands of them. They screeched through the air with a terrifying banshee wail, trailing sparks and smoke. Unlike a cannonball that smashed through stone, the Congreve rocket was an incendiary device. When it crashed into a building, it didn't just explode, it burst into an intense, inextinguishable chemical fire. Copenhagen was a city built largely of wood and timber. As the rockets rained down, fires broke out simultaneously in dozens of neighbourhoods. The city's fire brigade, brave as they were, was overwhelmed. The British firing schedule was relentless, a deliberate cadence designed to prevent any organised firefighting efforts. Just as a bucket chain was formed to douse a burning home, a mortar shell would land nearby, scattering the rescuers. The bombardment lasted for 3 nights. The first night was a shock. The second night was a tragedy. By the third night, September 4th, the city was a vision of hell. The spire of the Church of Our Lady, a landmark visible for miles, caught fire. Witnesses described the copper roof glowing red-hot before the entire structure collapsed into the nave, igniting the massive library stored inside. The smoke was so thick it blotted out the sun the following morning, and the heat was so intense it could be felt by the British sailors on their ships in the harbour. General Payman was in an impossible position. His militia was demoralised, the civilian population was panicking, and the city was literally burning down around him. Over 2,000 civilians had been killed, men, women and children. Roughly 30% of the city's buildings were damaged or destroyed. And yet, the British had barely lost a man. They were dismantling the capital from a distance, untouchable and unyielding. The psychological strain was precisely what the British had calculated. This was compellence in its rawest form. The message from the British batteries was clear. We do not want to occupy your city. We do not want to govern you. We want the ships. Give us the ships, or we will burn this city until there is nothing left but ash. On the morning of September 5th, as the fires still raged and the British guns paused to cool and reload, a Danish officer emerged from the smoke-choked city gates under a white flag. The will of the defence had broken. General Payman, seeing the futility of sacrificing the entire population for the sake of the fleet, asked for a ceasefire to discuss surrender. The bombardment ceased. The silence that followed was reportedly more deafening than the guns. On September 7th, General Payman signed the Articles of Capitulation. The terms were absolute. The British Army would occupy the citadel and the dockyards immediately. They would remain there for 6 weeks, just long enough to prepare the Danish fleet for sea, and then they would depart. In that time, every available seaworthy vessel was to be handed over to Admiral Gambier. What followed was one of the most systematic and efficient looting operations in military history. The Royal Navy did not merely want to take the ships, they wanted to ensure that Denmark could not build another fleet for a generation. They descended upon the Holman naval base like locusts. The prize list was staggering. The British seized 18 ships of the line, 11 frigates, and 42 smaller vessels, ranging from gunbrigs to sloops. This alone would have been a coup, effectively removing a major naval power from the global chessboard in a single stroke. But the British went further. They emptied the naval stores. Warehouses were stripped bare. The British loaded nearly 20,000 tons of equipment onto their transport ships. They took everything necessary to build and maintain a navy. Miles of seasoned hemp rope, thousands of bolts of canvas sailcloth, mountains of oak timber, pine masts, barrels of tar, anchors, and even the tools from the workshops. It is said that they swept the floors for nails. The goal was total disarmament. When the British were finished, the Copenhagen dockyards, once the pride of the Baltic, were nothing more than empty shells. The logistics of this theft were as impressive as the combat operation. The British now possessed a ghost fleet, dozens of massive warships, but no crews to sail them. Admiral Gambier and Lord Cathcart had to improvise. They stripped their own ships of non-essential personnel, utilised the thousands of British transport sailors, and even recruited some disaffected Danes and foreign labourers to man the prizes. For the citizens of Copenhagen, watching this process was a prolonged humiliation. For 6 weeks, they watched as their national heritage, the physical manifestation of their kingdom's power and history, was refitted by foreign sailors. The ships they had paid for with their taxes were renamed or simply numbered, their Danish flags struck and replaced by the Union Jack. By late October, the work was done. The British Armada, now swollen to a gargantuan size, prepared to leave. The transport ships were so overloaded with looted naval stores that they sat dangerously low in the water. As they weighed anchor and sailed out of the Sound, they left behind a shattered city and a seething population. The operation was a tactical masterpiece. In terms of cost-benefit analysis, it was perhaps the most successful raid in the history of warfare. Britain had secured complete naval supremacy in the North Sea for the cost of a few hundred casualties and some artillery shells. They had neutralised the threat of a northern coalition before it could even form. Napoleon's plan to use the Danish fleet to invade England was dead in the water, because the water now belonged entirely to Britain. However, as the fleet sailed back toward the Thames, laden with the spoils of war, the news of the victory travelled ahead of them. But instead of the universal acclaim that usually greeted a returning conqueror, the Copenhagen standoff was met with a complicated and often hostile reception. Britain had won the ships, but the battle for the moral high ground was just beginning. When the victorious Armada returned to England in late 1807, the sight was undeniable proof of British naval dominance. The Thames was choked with captured Danish warships. In a material sense, the mission was a triumph. The immediate threat of a northern invasion force had been liquidated. But as the smoke cleared over Copenhagen, a different kind of fog settled over London, a fog of political scandal and moral outrage. In Parliament, the debate was ferocious. The opposition tore into George Canning and the government. They argued that by attacking a neutral nation, a nation that had not fired a single shot at a British ship, Great Britain had debased itself. They claimed the attack was a violation of the law of nations, an act of state-sponsored piracy that erased the moral distinction between the tyrant Napoleon and the liberator Britain. One member of Parliament famously declared that while the government had saved the country from a physical danger, they had sacrificed its national honour to do so. Canning's defence was cold, modern, and pragmatic. He argued the doctrine of necessity. Self-preservation is the first law of nature. He laid out the intelligence regarding the secret articles of Tilsit, though he refused to reveal his sources, protecting his spies. His argument was the grandfather of the modern preemptive strike doctrine. Britain, he argued, could not wait to be attacked. In a war for national survival, against a continental hegemon, the rules of 18th century chivalry no longer applied. If the choice was between being called a pirate or being invaded, Canning would happily choose the pirate's life. However, on the international stage, the cost was severe. Napoleon, a master of propaganda, seized upon the event with glee. He painted the British as the vultures of the seas, a nation of shopkeepers who bombarded women and children to steal timber and rope. It was a potent narrative that resonated across Europe. The most immediate consequence was the loss of the very neutrality Britain had claimed to be protecting. Denmark, enraged and humiliated, abandoned its policy of neutrality and threw itself entirely into the arms of France. For the remainder of the Napoleonic Wars, Denmark became one of Napoleon's most loyal allies. The Danish king authorized privateers to swarm the Baltic, harassing British merchant shipping in what became known as the Gunboat War. While these small Danish boats couldn't challenge the Royal Navy's ships of the line, they were a constant, thorny nuisance that tied up British resources for years. Furthermore, the Copenhagen spirit poisoned relations with other potential friends. Tsar Alexander I of Russia, using the attack as a convenient pretext, formally declared war on Great Britain shortly after, solidifying the Anglo-Russian War. Even across the Atlantic, the United States watched with growing alarm. The ruthlessness Britain displayed at Copenhagen contributed to the rising tensions over maritime rights that would eventually explode into the War of 1812. The victory at Copenhagen had secured the North Sea, but it had isolated Britain politically. It proved that while the Royal Navy could compel nations to surrender their hardware, it could not bombard them into friendship. The British had won the naval war, but they had arguably lost the diplomatic one. Yet, despite the moral outcry and the diplomatic freezing, the cold, hard facts of the war supported Canning. With the Danish fleet in British hands, Napoleon's dream of invading England was pushed from improbable to impossible. The wall of wood around the British Isles remained intact, but there was one final, lingering question. The British had stolen the ships, but what became of them? The fate of the Copenhagen prizes serves as the final, ironic twist in this tale of terrifying diplomacy. When the dust settled and the surveyors of the Royal Navy boarded their new acquisitions in the dockyards of Chatham and Portsmouth, they found themselves staring at a paradox. The Danish ships were, by and large, excellent vessels. The Danish naval architects were skilled, and the ships were well built, fast, and sturdy. Under normal circumstances, they would have been a welcome addition to any fleet. However, the Royal Navy in 1807 was the largest industrial organization in the world, built on standardization. They had preferred classes of ships, standardized gun decks, and specific supply chains. The Danish ships, with their different dimensions and specifications, were logistical anomalies. To refit them for active British service would require specialized parts and non-standard repairs. Consequently, of the massive haul that cost the city of Copenhagen its skyline and its innocence, remarkably few of these ships ever fired a shot in anger under the British flag. A handful saw active service, primarily as convoy escorts or block ships, but the vast majority of the Copenhagen prizes suffered a much more ignoble fate. They became hulks. Stripped of their masts and rigging, these proud ships of the line were towed into the mudflats of the Medway and the Thames. They were converted into floating prison ships to house French prisoners of war, or used as floating depots for coal and gunpowder. The Christian VII, one of the finest Danish ships, eventually became a lazaretto, a quarantine ship for the sick. Others simply rotted at anchor in Rotten Row, slowly disintegrating until they were broken up for firewood decades later. This creates a striking historical irony. Britain had burned a neutral capital, killed thousands of civilians, united the continent against them, and branded themselves international pariahs, all to seize a fleet that they essentially treated as garbage. But to view this as a failure is to misunderstand the ruthless logic of the operation. The strategic value of the Danish fleet was not in its presence in Portsmouth, but in its absence from Copenhagen. Every rotting hull in the Medway was a ship that could not transport a French soldier to the beaches of Kent. Every frigate turned into a coal depot was a frigate that could not harass British merchantmen in the Caribbean. The Copenhagen standoff was the ultimate expression of the British strategy of sea denial. It proved that the Royal Navy's primary weapon was not always the cannonball, but the calculator. The Admiralty had run the numbers. They calculated that the diplomatic cost of being hated by Europe was less than the strategic cost of fighting a combined Franco-Danish-Russian fleet in the English Channel. In this light, the rusting, unused Danish ships were not a waste. They were the most effective defensive fortifications Britain possessed. They were trophies of a preemptive strike that bought Britain the security she needed to endure the long, grinding years of war that lay ahead. The operation ensured that for the rest of the Napoleonic Wars, the Royal Navy would face no significant challenge in the North Sea. The wall of wood held firm, not because it was reinforced, but because the enemy's battering ram had been stolen before it could be swung. The Second Battle of Copenhagen is often relegated to a footnote in the grand history of the Napoleonic Wars. It lacks the romantic heroism of Trafalgar or the finality of Waterloo. There are no statues in London squares dedicated to the bombardment of 1807. It is a victory that the British Empire was happy to pocket, but hesitant to celebrate. Yet, in answering the central question of how the Royal Navy captured an entire fleet without a naval engagement, we uncover a turning point in the history of warfare. The operation was a grim harbinger of the modern age. It was a victory achieved not through the dashing courage of boarding parties or the skillful maneuvering of sailing masters, but through the cold application of total war. The British success relied on three distinct pillars that would come to define the 19th century British way of war. First was the primacy of intelligence. The victory was won the moment the British spies uncovered the secrets of the Tilsit raft. It demonstrated that in a global conflict, information was as lethal as gunpowder. The ability to react to a threat before it materialized allowed Britain to dictate the terms of the engagement. Second was the effectiveness of joint operations. For centuries, the Army and Navy were often rivals, operating in separate spheres. Copenhagen proved that when they worked in perfect synchronization, the Navy locking the door while the Army squeezed the room, they were unstoppable. It was a masterclass in amphibious power projection, a capability that would allow Britain to police the globe for the next century. Third, and most uncomfortably, was the doctrine of disproportionate force. The use of Congreve rockets and terror bombardment against a civilian population shattered the gentlemanly codes of the 18th century. It established a ruthless precedent. When the survival of the empire was at stake, there were no non-combatants. The British government proved it was willing to burn a European capital to the ground rather than risk the security of the British Isles. For the men involved, the campaign was a crucial stepping stone. For Sir Arthur Wellesley, Copenhagen was his European debut. The efficiency with which he crushed the Danish militia at Koog gave the British government the confidence to entrust him with the command in Portugal the following year. In many ways, the road to Waterloo began in the muddy fields of Denmark. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of 1807 is the silence of the North Sea. For the remainder of the war, and indeed for decades to come, no power dared to challenge the Royal Navy in those waters. The Copenhagen standoff sent a message that echoed louder than any cannon. The Royal Navy was not just a fighting force, it was an irresistible force of nature that could reach into the harbours of neutral nations and pluck out their defences at will. The capture of the Danish fleet remains one of the most audacious, controversial, and successful heists in military history. It was a victory won without fighting the enemy's ships, achieved by breaking the enemy's heart. It proved that in the desperate struggle against Napoleon, the British Lion was prepared to be just as predatory as the French Eagle. As the last British sail dipped below the horizon in late 1807, leaving a smoking city in its wake, the world understood a new reality. The sea did not belong to the nations that bordered it. It belonged to the Royal Navy. And they would do whatever was necessary to keep it that way. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this history as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.